Welcome to the Baby Let's Talk podcast. My name is Ragna and I am your host. I am a medical doctor, a certified pre-postnatal trainer and a mother of 4, and I help moms reclaim their health and reach their goals through the power of movement, nutrition and overall healthy lifestyle. This podcast is born from my dedication to uncovering the truths about nutrition, exercise and lifestyle that genuinely benefit our bodies. We'll explore how to establish a lasting, healthy lifestyle that fits the reality of motherhood, how to enjoy an active, pain-free pregnancy, and how to navigate postpartum recovery to regain your fitness in a wholesome way. Join me as we debunk myths and discover the paths to excess energy, body confidence, and loving the life you live as a mom. Welcome to episode 4 of the Baby Let's Talk podcast. In this episode, we will dive into a really hot topic, macronutrients. That is protein, fat and carbs. How much do we need of each macronutrient group for optimal health? How to use the macronutrient ratio to our advantage based on our starting point and our goals. What food sources should we focus on for each macronutrient group, and so much more. If you haven't listened to the first 3 episodes of this podcast, I'd recommend that you pause this episode, listen to episodes 1, 2 and 3 and then come back. Because this episode is part of a series of foundational episodes on which all future episodes in this podcast will build upon. So first we're laying the ground with foundational knowledge so that we really understand how our body works, no matter your background, so that we're better equipped to make informed dietary and lifestyle choices that best serves our health. Now, in today's society, we are very well aware of the fact that nutrition profoundly impacts our health status across all stages of life, and that unhealthy dietary habits represent one of the most important causes of disability, diseases, and premature death. So, achieving optimal health, extending longevity, and last but not least, increasing the quality of life for all the years living, that really depends on our diet. However, the definition of an optimal diet remains controversial, but regardless of any dietary standpoint, the intake of macronutrients stands out as a fundamental element of any nutritional strategy, and this is because of their profound impact on energy regulation, like we've talked about in previous episodes, also body composition and overall health. But before we dive into all that, we'll just go over a few things here. So, nutrients are essential compounds that are required to sustain physiological processes, and nutrients are divided into 2 main groups, macronutrients and micronutrients. Now, macronutrients, these are compounds that our body requires in large amounts, and they are used for generating energy, building structural components, and synthesizing hormones and enzymes, and overseeing metabolic activities. And the three macronutrient groups are proteins, carbohydrates, and fats or lipids. And all 3 macronutrients are considered sources of energy, but carbohydrates and fat are the main sources of energy. The primary role of dietary protein is not energy provision, but rather to supply amino acids for the synthesis and repair of body tissues, for production of enzymes and hormones and other critical physiological processes, but it is seldom used as a main energy source, except when the preferred sources, carbs and fats, are insufficient. Then the body does turn to protein as an energy source, and this is, for example, during long fasts, starvation, glycolytic crisis, and so forth. Now, micronutrients, on the other hand, are compounds that are required in smaller quantities and include vitamins, minerals, and antioxidants. They play key roles in a wide range of biochemical processes, such as gene transcription modulation, catalyzing enzymatic reactions, and protection against oxidative damage, for example. So, let's dive into macronutrients today. And first we'll go over what each macronutrient group is and what their purpose is. So proteins, these are large complexes made up of varying amounts of and combinations of amino acids that are linked together via peptide bonds. That is, these are large complexes that are made from amino acids, and amino acids are organic compounds that are composed of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, and sometimes sulfur. And there are 20 different amino acids in the human body, 9 of which are considered essential because the body cannot synthesize them by itself. So we must get them through diet. And dietary proteins contain about 4 kilograms of energy per gram, which is similar to carbohydrates. But despite that, proteins are a less efficient energy source than carbohydrates or fat, and we'll go into that later. But the most important function of dietary proteins is to supply the body with amino acids, which provide the body with nitrogen, hydrocarbon skeletons, and sulfur, which are used in the body for mechanical and structural purposes, and to help synthesize enzymes, hormones, antibodies, cytokines, transporters, and neurotransmitters. So consuming dietary protein is important to enhance amino acid availability, to boost protein synthesis, and to prevent protein breakdown, and to maintain overall protein equilibrium in the body. Now, carbohydrates, like we went over in great detail in the blood glucose episodes, carbohydrates are large complexes built up of monosaccharide molecules, that is, large complexes of sugars. And now just a little reminder, monosaccharides are the most basic sugar molecules, and we have the 3 monosaccharide molecules, glucose, fructose, and galactose. And then we have disaccharides, such as sucrose and lactose, also known as table sugar and milk sugar, respectively. And these are constructed of then 2 monosaccharide molecules together. Sucrose is constructed of 1 glucose and 1 fructose molecule, and lactose is constructed of 1 glucose and 1 galactose molecule. And then we have the polysaccharides, which are larger saccharide complexes, large complexes of monosaccharides joined together, like starch, the storage form of glucose in plants, and glycogen, which is the storage form of glucose in the human body. And polysaccharides are also called complex carbohydrates, while mono and disaccharides are called simple carbohydrates or sugars. Now, all the cells in our body need fuel to produce energy and stay alive and function, and glucose is the most important source of energy. Now, just to make one thing clear regarding energy, or more specifically the word energy, food itself is not energy, nor are the macronutrients from the food. So in relation to energy, we either refer to food or the macronutrient compounds of food as fuel or as a source of energy, but food itself is not energy. It is not usable energy already. We use the nutrients from the food to produce usable energy, okay? Now, all of our cells prefer glucose to run their energy production on, or ATP production, as the energy production process is most efficient when cells use glucose as fuel. The process runs smoothest and with the least amount of detrimental effect with glucose oxidation. That is when the cells burn glucose for energy production. But most of our body cells can also use fatty acids from fats as their main fuel for energy production, like we've talked about in previous episodes, but not all cells can do that. The brain cannot use fatty acids, for example. It can only use glucose and ketones, but we'll go into that in a later episode. So, as we've talked about in previous episodes, running energy production on fatty acid oxidation does come at a cost, as fatty acid oxidation is not as efficient as glucose oxidation for producing ATP or usable energy, and it leads to increased reactive oxygen species production. So in other words, it leads to more oxidative stress, which is harmful for our cells. It's harmful for the mitochondria in our cells, the cell's engines or the cell's energy production factories, which can over time then further slow down the energy production process, making it even less efficient. That is, the energy production process is less efficient when the cells burn or oxidize fatty acids instead of glucose, and more ROS are also produced when oxidizing or burning fatty acids compared to glucose, which is harmful for the cell and makes the energy production process less effective. So the cell's engine don't run as smoothly, and we can think of it like this, that when the cell uses glucose as fuel for the energy production process, that is, when it burns glucose, that leads to some amount of smoke, that is, it leads to the production of some amount of ROS and other intermediates of the energy production process that have negative effects on the cell's health. But when the cell uses fatty acids as fuel, when it burns fatty acids, it produces a lot darker and more and darker smoke. And having too much smoke inside the cell is harmful and damaging to the mitochondria and to the cell itself, especially because of ROS production. This is oxidative stress. Now, in addition to this, running on fatty acid oxidation for energy production makes the cells more insulin resistant, like we talked about in our last episode. And we want to avoid that in the long run, as it gives the signal to the body that there is lack of energy. That is, if the majority of our cells that are able are running their energy production on fatty acid oxidation, our body then thinks that we must be in an energy deficient state because the cells are not using the preferred fuel, glucose, as their main fuel. And when that's the case, the body interprets that as a lack of energy. That is, that it is lacking in glucose, and that's a metabolically stressful state. So it drives up the secretion of stress hormones in order to first release glucose from storage and then get the liver to produce more glucose from other non-carbohydrate sources, such as amino acids, and also to further partition the best fuel, quote unquote, glucose, that the body does have to the most important tissues, such as the nervous system. And in addition, or as a support to this fuel partitioning, the stress hormones also promote the breakdown and release of fatty acids from fat stores to increase the availability of free fatty acids in the bloodstream to use for tissues that are able to use fatty acids as fuel. And these hormones also suppress the action of insulin, so that the cells of less important tissues, quote unquote, do not take up glucose. That is, so that these tissues don't use up the little glucose that the body does have, because the more important tissues are supposed to use it, like the brain. Now, also, when the cells are running their energy production process on fatty acids, the fatty acid oxidation itself supports further fatty acid oxidation and blocks the utilization of glucose as fuel. It leads to even more fatty acids being released into the bloodstream from storage, so the levels of free fatty acids in the blood increases, which further supports fatty acid oxidation, the usage of fatty acids by the cells, and so forth. So it goes in circles here, and we've talked in great detail in previous episodes about this. So carbohydrates are an important energy source for our body, and they are its preferred fuel for energy production for several reasons. One being that the energy production process is most efficient when using glucose for producing ATP or energy. Secondly, glucose oxidation, that is the burning of glucose as fuel for energy production, leads to lower amounts of detrimental compounds such as reactive oxygen species being produced compared with fatty acid oxidation, which results in more ROS production, that is more oxidative stress. Thirdly, using glucose for oxidation in ATP production makes the cells more sensitive to insulin. So more glucose is then taken from the bloodstream and into the cells. That is, the cells are less insulin resistant. They are more sensitive to insulin. They respond better to insulin, and therefore the body is more glucose tolerant, quote unquote. It tolerates glucose better because glucose is easily taken up into the cells, because the cells are insulin sensitive. Because when a cell uses fatty acids for oxidation and not glucose, it blocks the usage of glucose and leads to a buildup of glucose within the cell that isn't used for energy production. So the cell becomes more resistant to insulin, less sensitive to insulin, because it doesn't want more glucose inside itself because it cannot use it. So the cell becomes more insulin resistant. And lastly, when the energy production process is efficient, when the cells are using mostly glucose as fuel, then more of the fuel that's coming in with food goes to the energy production process, and less fuel is then put to storage in fat tissue. But if the efficiency of the energy production process is reduced, as is what happens when the cells predominantly run on fatty acid oxidation for a prolonged period of time, then less of the fuel that's coming in with food goes to the energy production process and is rather than put to storage in our fat tissue for use later. So to translate this, when our cells are mostly running energy production on glucose, then the glucose that's coming in with food from carbohydrates goes smoothly into the energy production process. But if our cells are relying too heavily on fatty acid oxidation, then the body is not able to use glucose effectively, so it converts a lot of the glucose that it cannot use to fatty acids to be put to storage in fat tissue, because the body is making sure not to run empty on that fuel because it realizes that it's using mostly fatty acids for fuel, so it cannot run empty on this vital fuel. Now, dietary carbohydrates, they contain about 4 kilocalories of energy per gram, just like protein, while fats contain about 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. And as we've talked about in previous episodes, carbohydrate intake raises blood glucose levels, stimulating insulin secretion, which promotes glucose uptake into our cells to use for immediate energy production or to store for later use. And in addition, carbohydrates, they do play an important role in gut health and immune function. Now, then we have fiber, that are a type of non-digestible carbohydrates with multiple subtypes. And fiber is a vital part in promoting satiety and supporting gastrointestinal function. And we touched a little bit on fiber in a previous episode, and we will talk in more detail about fiber in a later episode when we talk about gut health. Now, we've touched on some important basics regarding carbohydrates, so let's talk about dietary fats. So the term fat refers specifically to triglycerides that are the main components of vegetable oils and fatty tissue in animals. And this term is also used more broadly as a synonym of lipid, that is any substance of biological relevance that is insoluble in water but soluble in non-polar solvents. And in this context, the term encompasses not only triglycerides but also various other compounds such as mono and diglycerides, phospholipids like lecithin, sterols like cholesterol, waxes such as beeswax, and free fatty acids, all of which are typically found in smaller quantities in the human diet. Now, dietary fats or lipids are the most energy-dense macronutrient group and provide 9 kilocalories of energy per gram. And lipids or fats are essential for the maintenance of cellular structure, for the production of hormones, sex hormones, regulation of body temperature, absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K, for energy storage as body fat, and for protection from physical trauma. And in addition to this, dietary fats enhance the taste, texture, and palatability of foods. And they also help with satiety, keeping you fuller for longer, and they support digestion. And we'll go into that a little bit further in more detail later. Now, different types of dietary fats have varying impacts on our health, and these different types are saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, polyunsaturated fats, and trans fats. And the distinction between saturated and unsaturated fats lies in their chemical structure, affecting their physical state at room temperature and their impact on health. Now, fatty acids are constructed of a chain of carbon atoms, and saturated fats have a chemical structure that is characterized by the absence of double bonds between the carbon atoms in their fatty acid chains. This means that all the carbon atoms are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. There are no double bonds in the fatty acid chains. And the lack of double bonds makes these fats solid at room temperature. Now, saturated fats are commonly found in animal products like meat, dairy products, butter, cheese, whole milk, and in certain plant-based sources like coconut oil, cocoa butter, palm oil, just to name a few. And historically, saturated fats have actually been linked to an increased risk of heart disease and high cholesterol levels because of their ability to raise LDL, or low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, which is often referred to as the bad cholesterol. Now, high levels of LDL cholesterol have been associated with an increased risk of coronary artery disease. However, recent research has challenged the uniformity of this claim, suggesting that the impact of saturated fats on health may actually be nuanced and dependent on overall dietary context, and we will get into this in much more detail later on. Now, unsaturated fats are characterized by the presence of one or more double bonds between the carbon atoms in the fatty acid chains. So this structural difference reduces the number of hydrogen atoms that are attached to the carbon chain, And unsaturated fats can be divided into monounsaturated and polyunsaturated fats, depending on how many double bonds they have. So monounsaturated fats, these fats contain only one double bond, mono meaning one, in their fatty acid chains. So they are liquid at room temperature, but they then start to solidify if you put them in the refrigerators, for example. Now, common sources include olive oil, avocados, coconuts, and most other nuts. Now, polyunsaturated fats, poly means many, so these fats contain 2 or more double bonds in their fatty acid chain. And they remain liquid even when chilled, when put in the refrigerator. So polyunsaturated fats include essential fatty acids like omega-3 and omega-6 fatty acids. And polyunsaturated fats, also called PUFAs, are found in foods like nuts, seeds, fatty fish such as salmon, mackerel, and sardines. And then they are found in high concentrations in vegetable oils or seed oils such as sunflower oil, corn oil, soybean oil, rapeseed oil, canola oil, and so forth. Now, unsaturated fats have been considered healthier than saturated fats because they don't increase LDL levels in the blood. And they're said to support easing inflammation and provide other cardiovascular benefits. But we'll dive deeper into the difference between saturated and polyunsaturated fats in a separate episode. And lastly, we have the trans fats, also called trans unsaturated fatty acids or trans fatty acids. Now, trace concentrations of trans fats do occur naturally, but large amounts are found in some processed foods. So naturally occurring trans fats are produced in the gut of some animals, for example, ruminant animals, and foods from these animals, for example, dairy products and meat products, may therefore contain small quantities of these fats. But artificial trans fats are created in an industrial process that adds hydrogen to unsaturated fatty acids, making them more saturated and therefore they are made more solid at room temperature. So as you remember, unsaturated fatty acids have one or more double bonds in their fatty acid chain, meaning that they have fewer hydrogen atoms attached to the chain. But by adding an hydrogen atom to an unsaturated fatty acid chain, it breaks then up the double bond and makes it more saturated with hydrogen. And this process is known as hydrogenation and is often used to increase the shelf life and stability of foods that use these fats. Now, artificial trans fats can be found in a variety of food products, including margarine, snack foods, packaged baked goods, all sorts of processed foods, and it is also used for frying fast food. Now, due to health concerns that have been associated with trans fats, such as increased risk of heart disease, the use of artificial trans fats are highly regulated and are banned in many countries. But the FDA, or Food and Drug Administration, the FDA's definition of 0 trans fats per serving is actually less than 1 gram of trans fat per tablespoon, or less than 0.5 grams per serving size. So manufacturers are allowed to say that their product includes 0 trans fats as long as the amount is less than 0.5 grams per serving size. And in European regulations, manufacturers only need to disclose of the amount of trans fats in food if the amount exceeds the limit of 2% of the fat in the product. So trans fats are still found in a lot of processed foods all over the world, although to a lesser degree than it was before. Now, back to the macronutrients. Overconsuming on any macronutrient is not directly toxic, but chronic macronutrient overconsumption, that is, consuming too much of any macronutrient over a long period of time, may lead to some issues for various reasons. Firstly, chronic excess energy source intake or fuel intake from carbohydrates and fats, that is associated with weight gain, which is well known in terms of body fat, obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, and other adverse health outcomes associated with increased adiposity. That is, it leads to an increased amount of body fat, which is associated with these adverse health outcomes. Now, interestingly, eating too much protein alone is not associated with increased adiposity, that is increased body fat, and it has been shown to improve body composition, especially in individuals who engage in resistance training, that is, who work out regularly. But one thing that's worth mentioning in regards to high protein diets is that there has been some debate concerning the safety of high protein diets, as some researchers have proposed that diets that are high in protein may lead to kidney damage and kidney disease, but this has been proven not to be correct, as high protein diets have been proven not to be a risk factor for developing chronic kidney disease in otherwise healthy individuals. So the main thing we need to be mindful about in regards to excess macronutrient intake is the excess maybe calorie intake it involves, especially if the macronutrients are mainly coming from unhealthy food sources and the consequences of increased weight and adiposity. But consuming too much of a single macronutrient group in a diet that is calorie appropriate, that is, if we're not eating too much of, or if we're eating too much of one macronutrient group while not eating too many calories, that means that some other macronutrient group is likely being displaced to remain within the calorie limits. That is, it means that we may not be eating enough of any of the other macronutrient groups. Now, and if this is chronic, this practice can result in some nutrient deficiencies. For example, one example is a ketogenic diet, which is a high-fat, low-carb, and often adequate or high-protein diet. Now, regarding macronutrient deficiencies, that is eating too little of some macronutrient group, making sure that we get enough protein in our diet is probably the most important, because sufficient protein intake is essential for health and well-being at all ages. It is essential for growth and development in children, and in adults it is important for maintaining lean body mass and prevent age-related loss of skeletal muscle mass, as well as being vital for numerous important processes in the body, like we've talked about before in this episode. But nevertheless, protein undernutrition is actually quite common in both developing and developed countries. And there are more than 1 billion people worldwide that have chronically insufficient protein intake. And it's not only in children in Central Africa or South Asia, of which 30% are affected by protein malnutrition. It's also 50% of homebound elderly individuals in the US, for example. And the consequences of protein malnutrition range from mild to life-threatening. And they can be very unspecific, such as stunting, that is impaired growth in children, anemia, impaired nutrient absorption, cardiovascular dysfunction, muscle wasting, immunodeficiency, hypoalbuminemia, edema, loss of bone mass, skin atrophy, impaired hormone production, particularly of growth hormones and thyroid hormones and insulin, and intrauterine growth restriction, that is when a pregnant woman is affected by protein malnutrition, the baby in the womb doesn't grow at the expected rate. So protein deficiency can have quite serious consequences and is sadly not uncommon. Now, in contrast to protein, lipid or fat and carbohydrate deficiencies are, on the other hand, extremely rare, but low intake of lipids or carbohydrates can have some important implications for health and disease. Now, strictly speaking, carbohydrates are not considered essential nutrients because the body can synthesize carbohydrates endogenously. That is, the body can make carbohydrates itself from other non-carbohydrate sources like amino acids. And the body can also use other energy sources like fatty acids and ketones instead of glucose. But we will get into more detail on this later on. That is why we do not want to be running our body on that state. And you might remember from the essentials from previous episodes. But another thing about foods that contain carbohydrates, that is nutrient-dense sources of carbohydrates, such as fruits, some vegetables and so forth, is that they contain nutrients and bioactive compounds that are associated with many health benefits. So that's another reason why not to avoid healthy natural carbohydrate foods. Regarding lipids or fats, the human body can also synthesize various forms of lipids endogenously, that is in the body. But in contrast to carbohydrates, lipids are an essential macronutrient. They must be a part of the diet to provide essential fatty acids and allow for the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins from our food, the vitamins A, D, E, and K, which are very important for our health. Now, essential fatty acids include alpha-linolenic acid, omega-3, and linoleic acid, omega-6. Now, with that being said, deficiency in these essential fatty acids is extremely rare in individuals with a regular diet and is most common in individuals with severe fat malabsorption. That is, individuals that have severe problems with digesting and absorbing fat from the digestive system, or in people receiving fat-free parenteral nutrition, that is, infusing a specialized form of food intravenously, that is, through a vein. So when it occurs, essential fatty acid deficiency can present with dermatitis, which is just a word describing a number of skin irritations and rashes. It's an inflammation in the skin. It can present with hair loss, liver dysfunction due to mitochondrial dysfunction in the liver cells, and increased susceptibility to infections, to name a few. So fatty acid deficiency is not as critical as protein deficiency and definitely not as common. Now, on with the part I know you've probably been waiting for. How much of each macronutrient group should we consume in a day for the best health results? And you're probably also thinking fitness results or to attain the physique you desire, which is okay. Now, we'll begin with protein. And protein primarily serves structural functions in the body. And it is constantly undergoing synthesis and breakdown in the body. So in situations where food is scarce and glycogen reserves are exhausted, we've used up our glycogen source from the liver, then protein becomes a key source of precursors for gluconeogenesis, or the production of glucose by the liver, through the release of glucogenic amino acids during proteolysis, or the breakdown of protein. Now, the process of proteolysis, that is the breakdown of protein to amino acids, is suppressed by insulin. That is, when insulin levels are increased, the breakdown of protein does not happen. Because as we remember from one of our previous episodes, insulin is an anabolic hormone, and anabolism is the building up aspect of metabolism, whereas catabolism is the breaking down aspect of metabolism, which is driven by the stress hormones. So during extended periods of fasting, when insulin levels are low, because as we remember, insulin is secreted in response to elevated blood glucose levels, but during fasting, blood glucose levels decrease. So when there is a relative lack of insulin, then enough glucogenic amino acids are released from protein in our body for the liver to produce glucose from them, and thereby helping to keep blood glucose levels within the normal range to provide the most important tissues of our body with fuel. But this process comes at the cost of a slow yet ongoing reduction of structural protein in our body. That is, our body is breaking down protein from the muscles and other tissues, but a significant amount is coming from our skeletal muscles. But this process is not extensive during regular normal fasting, like during the night, for example. But if it becomes prolonged, such as during prolonged fasting or prolonged calorie restriction, or during carbohydrate restriction for that matter, there is low-carb diets or keto diets. That is, if carbohydrates are not coming in with the diet or not enough of them on a regular basis for a prolonged period of time, protein then becomes the primary source for glucose production in the body. And this process does come with potential costs to the body in terms of both muscle wasting, but also because of the increased production of intermediates that might be harmful or at least not beneficial for our health. So while the process of gluconeogenesis, the production of glucose in the liver, while this process itself does not directly produce harmful intermediates, the amino acid catabolism that is required to supply substrates, amino acids, for this process, this can lead to increased production of compounds such as ammonia, which is a byproduct of amino acid deamination. That is, it's a byproduct of when we're breaking protein down into amino acids. In other words, when the metabolism of certain amino acids generates nitrogen-containing waste, primarily in the form of ammonia. Now, ammonia is toxic at high concentrations, so elevated levels of ammonia due to excessive protein breakdown or impaired liver function can lead to hyperammonemia, which is a condition that can disrupt normal brain function and in severe cases lead to hepatic encephalopathy. So ammonia must be converted by our liver to a substance called urea through a process called the urea cycle, so it can be then excreted safely in urine by our kidneys. Now, increased reliance on protein catabolism for energy can in the end strain these detoxification and excretion pathways, which can potentially lead to elevated levels of ammonia in our blood, especially in individuals who have already compromised liver function or kidney function. Now, also, excessive and prolonged breakdown of proteins can impact other bodily functions that rely on amino acids, including the synthesis of enzymes, synthesis of hormones and neurotransmitters and immune cells. And this can affect a lot of other aspects of health, everything from hormonal balance and mental health to immune resilience. And another potential issue is the contribution of amino acid catabolism to the body's acid-base balance. You see, amino acids are metabolized into various acids and bases, and excessive breakdown of amino acids during prolonged gluconeogenesis can contribute to metabolic acidosis, which is a condition characterized by increased acidity in the blood and body tissues, and if the kidneys cannot adequately excrete the excess acids. But while all of this is not common in healthy individuals, it can of course occur in specific cases, and we just need to keep that in mind. Like I said, if someone who is already, has some kidney disease or liver disease. So, but basically using amino acids from protein to create glucose is a smart but short-term fix when food is scarce. So if it goes on too long, it can lead to muscle loss, weaker muscles, and even put a strain on the body's detoxification systems and messing with other important physiological functions as well. So regarding a period of fasting, it is not only the fact that we're breaking down our body's protein to amino acids to use them for gluconeogenic purposes to create glucose. That's important to keep in mind, but it's also the fact that in the process of breaking down amino acids for gluconeogenesis, we get increased production of intermediates that are not good for our body, that are toxic, and we need to detoxify them so that we are able to get rid of them through urine. And doing this in the long term may have some negative effects. But also, and what's maybe more relevant in our everyday life, we want to get out of the stress-driven catabolic state that we are in during fasting because of the negative effects it has on our overall health to stay in that state for too long. So during fasting, for example, during the night, and in low-carb diets for that matter, we are in a primarily catabolic state, which is a stress hormone-driven state, and that comes at a cost. Like I've talked about so many times and in so many circles up until now in this podcast. And we will continue to talk about this throughout this podcast over and over again because it is so important. So one extremely important factor of the breakfast, our first meal of the day, the meal that breaks our fast, no matter when you have this meal, one important factor of this meal is to turn the switch from the stress hormone-driven catabolic state to an anabolic state, to the building up aspect of metabolism. And that's not merely because we want to start building our body up again after the period of fasting, but more importantly to minimize the cost of being in the stress-driven state for too long. Okay, back to dietary protein. So to sum it up, protein not only serves as a structural component in muscles, bones, organs, skin, hair, and nails, proteins are also the building blocks of antibodies. They are involved in the production of blood cells and in creating hormones and in creating cell membranes, and amino acids from which protein is built are crucial for neurotransmitter functions. They serve as building blocks for nucleic acids, DNA and RNA, for coenzymes and various life-sustaining molecules. So providing our body with sufficient amount of protein is essential. And if we do not get enough protein, we may experience protein deficiency, as I talked about earlier, which can be serious. So how much protein do we need each day? Now, the minimum amount of protein that the human body needs each day in order to just simply prevent protein deficiency is 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. Or in pounds, 0.36 grams of protein per pound of body weight. This is the RDA, and you've probably heard of that before, recommended daily allowance of protein. But the RDA is only the minimum amount that we must have in order to not get deficiency and in order to survive. And that does not equal an optimal protein intake per day. And it's important for you to be familiar with this because as you may begin to dive deeper into studies or guidelines on protein or nutrition in general, you may come across this number every now and then. So now you know at least what this number is, and you'll be able to maybe explain it also to others who you may be speaking with who are trying to find their way out of the macronutrient labyrinth. But 0.8 grams per kilogram per day is the minimum amount required to not get deficiency in protein. Now, the minimum amount of daily protein intake for a proper functioning body, that is a more optimal protein intake, is often suggested to be between 1.2 and 1.6 gram per kilogram of body weight or target body weight. You can use your body weight if your body weight is relatively within the normal weight limits for your gender and height and leanness and so forth. And in pounds, this equals about 0.54 to 0.73 grams per pound of body weight or target body weight. Now, other recommendations and studies suggest that this optimal range is a bit higher, or 0.6 to 0.8 grams per pound of body weight, or 1.32 to 1.76 grams per kilogram of body weight or target body weight. So when putting together the results and recommendations from the majority of studies that have been done in this field, the lower margin here for an optimal protein intake is around 1.2 to 1.3 grams per kilogram of body weight. And then the higher optimal margin is around 1.6 to 1.7. Or in pounds, the lower margin 0.5 to 0.6 grams per pound body weight up to 0.7, 0.8 grams per pound body weight or target body weight. Now, there's not a very big difference here, and these are just estimated suggestions for the optimal range. So this does not mean that we must aim at being exactly within this range. This really depends on the starting point and the goals of each and every one. So to see this a little bit more clearly, for a person that weighs, let's say, 60 kilograms or 132 pounds, or has a target body weight of 60 kilograms or about 132 pounds, this means that this person's optimal daily protein intake ranges from 72, 79 grams on the lower end to 96, 106 grams of protein on the higher end per day. Now, the upper limit here does not equal the maximum amount of protein that we should eat per day. This is simply the optimal range of protein intake that we should aim for in order to have, a well-functioning body, maintaining muscle mass and so forth. But studies on muscle building suggest that in order to maximize anabolism, that is maximizing resistance training induced gains in muscle mass and in strength, then we should aim at a minimum of 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or target body weight, or 0.7 grams of protein per pound body weight. So the same as the upper optimal limit here. So the minimum amount of protein required to maximize gains in muscle mass and strength ranges from 1.6 grams per kilogram and up to 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight or target body weight per day, or 0.7 to 1 gram per pound body weight per day. Now, in terms of percentage of total caloric intake, protein should be somewhere between 15 to 25% of your caloric intake each day. And for some people, like someone who's aiming to build lean muscle mass while also reducing body fat, like bodybuilders or other athletes, this number may be up to maybe 30%. But we will talk in more detail about this, that is the percentage of macronutrients of your daily calories, in another episode when we talk in much more detail about calories. So the recommended daily protein intake is dependent on several factors. So there's always the same absolute minimum that everyone needs, and that's 0.8 grams per kilogram of body weight or target body weight. And then the optimal intake for a well-functioning body ranges from 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight per day. But beyond that, or rather, if you really want to find the correct, quote unquote, or best amount of protein for you, then that's dependent on several factors like your starting point, where you're coming from, and then your goals. So if you're maybe someone who's maybe extremely underweight or severely overweight or obese, the best aim would be to use your goal body weight or your target body weight when you're calculating your amount of daily protein, instead of using your current weight, because otherwise you may either be under or overshooting on your protein goals if your weight is very low or very high. And then, of course, if your current weight is very far from your target body weight, then it's likely a good idea for you to gradually adapt your protein intake. For example, if you're someone who is severely underweight and based on your target body weight, you're supposed to eat a huge amount of protein, much more than you're used to maybe, then it makes sense, of course, to gradually increase the intake. But otherwise, if you're quite within the normal weight range, you can use your own weight to calculate this, or you can use also always your goal, your target body weight, if your weight is not quite where you want it to be. So to sum it up once again, the optimal protein intake ranges from 1.2 to 1.6 or 1.7 on the higher end of protein per kilogram of body weight or target body weight each day. But if your goal is to lose weight, cut down on some body fat, get a more fit, quote unquote, look, or to maintain a lean body, a lean figure, it's recommended to have a slightly higher protein intake, somewhere between 1.6 and 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or target body weight per day, or at least aim at being at the higher end of the optimal limit, so around 1.6, 1.7. But if you're in the process of building a lot of muscle, or maybe you're an elite athlete who's extremely physically active, aiming for the highest recommended amount of muscle building, that is 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, could be what's best for you. And this is based on studies done mainly on bodybuilders or men who are very physically active and engage in resistance training regularly. But studies have not found increased benefit with going any higher than 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight per day, especially in terms of muscle building. But just to make it clear, protein is important for so many more things, other things than simply just maintaining and building muscle mass, like we've talked about. It's also the main structural component in literally every other tissue, all tissues in our body and organs, as well as providing components for producing hormones and enzymes and so much more. So the goal of our protein intake is to make sure that we provide our body with sufficient protein for all structural purposes, including the repair and growth of muscles, and synthesis of enzymes and hormones, and the overall maintenance of cellular and tissue integrity throughout the body. Now, regarding the maximum amount of protein, like I said, it has not been found to be any more beneficial to exceed the 2.2 gram per kilogram of body weight per day. And some studies even mean that there's not much to gain from going above the higher optimal protein intake limit, which is 1.6, 1.7 gram per kilogram. But again, some may benefit from going as high as 2.2 grams per kilogram, like I said earlier, depending on the goals, or if one's maybe building a lot of muscle mass and so forth. Now, then regarding protein intake, then there's the question of when to eat all of your protein. Is it best to distribute it evenly between all meals during the day, or eat more protein early in the day or more later in the day? And then there's also the question of how much protein our body is able to utilize from a single meal. Now, regarding how much protein our body can utilize from a single meal, so studies that look at the maximum amount of protein that the body can utilize from a single meal report varying results here. And that's partially because this is all dependent on what the studies are looking at, what kind of protein is used in the studies, and what, if anything, the protein is combined with when it's eaten. So the majority of the studies in this field are often focusing on how much of the protein in a meal can be utilized for muscle growth that goes to muscle protein synthesis. And in addition, these studies often use fast digesting protein, which is often given without the addition of other macronutrients, carbs and fats. And some of these studies suggest that the maximum amount of protein that we are able to use from a single meal is actually only 25 to 30 grams of protein. But like so many other things regarding our bodies, this isn't quite so simple because, firstly, eating slower acting protein sources, and as we know, in combination with the other macronutrients, fats and carbs, and also fiber, delays the absorption and leads to enhanced utilization of the nutrients in the meal. So the type of protein and what it is consumed together with affects the digestion of the digestion rate of the protein, and therefore how much of the protein from the meal can be absorbed and used by the body. Now, secondly, dietary proteins aren't only used for muscle protein synthesis, like we've talked about, that is only for muscle maintenance and building. It is also used to make other proteins, and as proteins provide structural supports in many other tissues and organs, and enzymes are proteins and antibodies are proteins. So when dietary proteins are digested into amino acids, they also serve as the building blocks for enzymes and coenzymes and hormones. They're also critical for immune responses, for cellular repair, the production of blood cells, and various other life-sustaining molecules. And in addition, the nitrogen from the amino acids are also used to synthesize other non-protein molecules, such as purines and pyrimidines, which are the building blocks for nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So the maximum amount of protein we're able to use from a single meal is actually proposed to be much higher than the former proposed amount of 25 to 30 grams. And some studies suggest that the maximum is as high as 60 grams of protein. But again, this number may actually be even higher. We don't know everything here, as the experience of people who consume, for example, only one meal per day shows otherwise. That is, there are examples of bodybuilders and athletes, for example, who need much higher amounts of protein than 60 grams per day, that eat only one meal per day. So they eat maybe in a single meal 120 or 150 grams of protein or more, and they still get good results in terms of muscle building and maintain fine health. So there are nuances here, and we don't know everything about this. Now, regarding the distribution of protein throughout the day, one research that has looked at the existing evidence on daily dietary protein intake to maximize anabolism, that is, it was focusing on primarily the muscle building aspect of protein intake, suggests that an even distribution of daily protein intake between 4 meals was the most beneficial distribution. That is, aiming at having between 0.4 to 0.55 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight or target body weight per meal. And this is to reach the 1.6 to 2.2 grams of protein per kilogram per body weight per day. Or just, determine your protein intake for the whole day and then divide it by 4. But other research have found that eating the majority of dietary protein at breakfast, or that is earlier in the day, is more beneficial in terms of muscle maintenance and leads to higher muscle function, and is also associated with better cardiometabolic health in adults compared to eating most of the protein later in the day. But however you choose to distribute your protein intake, the most important thing is to get enough protein based on your needs and your goals, and then the distribution between the meals of the day is not equally as important, but studies maybe suggest that an even distribution throughout the day seems to be a good choice, and maybe having a larger protein intake earlier in the day may be more beneficial than having a larger intake later in the day. So in regards to our first meal of the day, our breakfast, that meal that breaks our fast after the night, regardless of when you have the first meal of your day, I call that breakfast. So having our breakfast high in protein has been shown to be very important. And according to studies on high protein breakfasts, a definition of high protein breakfast is a meal with about 35 grams of protein. But some people find that difficult to reach this amount of protein in one meal. So by at least aiming for 0.4 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight per that meal is a good goal. And that equals about 20 grams of protein for a person weighing 50 kilograms, 24 grams of protein for someone weighing 60 kilograms, 28 grams of protein for someone weighing 70 kilograms, and so forth. Now, regarding our first meal of the day, the breakfast, we want to, after the fast from the night, we want to switch from the catabolic state, the breaking down aspect of metabolism, to an anabolic state, the building up aspect of metabolism. So we want to do that in order to start repairing and building up the structures that we have broken down during the night's fast. For example, muscle protein, even though it's not extensive. But then we need to have enough protein coming in with our first meal of the day. But in general, a breakfast that is high in protein, preferably around 30-35 grams of protein, combined with some fats and some carbs, is a good start. And an important factor that kind of took me a while to really grasp and accept, actually, until I finally understood all of the mechanisms behind the energy balance of our cells, is to not leave the carbs out completely from this meal. Because protein does induce insulin secretion. It does cause the secretion of insulin into the blood to a lesser degree than carbs, but it's about 30% of what carbs do, but still. So if our breakfast, the first meal we have after a night's fast, when our blood glucose levels are low, the fasting blood glucose level, if that meal only contains proteins and then fats maybe and no carbs, then the insulin that is secreted in response to the protein will drive the glucose that is in the blood at that point into the cells, causing the blood glucose level to drop even more than it is as the fasting blood glucose level, that is to drop even lower than your fasting blood glucose. And this inhibits you from switching from the stress-driven catabolic state that you're in during the fast, during the night, to the anabolic state or the building up aspect of metabolism. Because by lowering your blood glucose levels even further, the stress hormones are upregulated again, or even more than they already are, in order to release glucose from storage and for the liver to make more glucose through gluconeogenesis to increase the blood glucose levels again. This is an energy deficient signal, and whenever the body senses energy deficiency, it upregulates stress hormones to partition fuel or glucose to the preferred fuel to the most important cells like the brain. And it promotes fatty acid oxidation in other less important tissues like muscle tissue, liver, etc. So at least for me, that was a huge eye-opener when I stopped doing this. That is, leaving the carbs out for the first meal for my breakfast, because I never really got it why I got so out of energy and dizzy and shaky just a short time after eating a healthy, high-protein breakfast. And it was simply because my blood sugar levels were dropping even lower and my stress-driven state was being upregulated instead of downregulated or switched off. So always including some carbs in the first meal of the day is really important in order to switch from the catabolic breaking down aspect of metabolism to the building up aspect. Now, just to make one thing clear in regards to a night's fast or a longer fast for that matter, a protein breakdown from skeletal muscles does not happen to a large degree. We talked about this a little bit before, that during fasting, one way our body uses to maintain stable blood glucose levels is to use amino acids from our body's proteins for the production of glucose in the liver, gluconeogenesis. That is to synthesize new glucose in the liver cells. But the main reason we want to break the fast is not mainly because of the protein breakdown that happens, because it's not very extensive, but it's more because we want to switch from the stress hormone-driven state that we are running on during fasting, the catabolic state of metabolism that the body runs on during a period of fasting to maintain adequate blood glucose concentration, as being in this state comes at a cost that aren't necessarily very beneficial overall and for the long run to maintain a healthy, smooth-running energy production in our cells. Now, studies on intermittent fasting, for example, have shown that with sufficient daily protein intake, fasting does not lead to increased muscle breakdown, and during fasting, during the night or longer as in intermittent fasting, the skeletal muscle breakdown is not extensive, and you can actually maintain a good muscle mass while doing intermittent fasting. But the thing is that during fasting, like we've learned, we're running our energy production on a stress hormone-driven state, and one of those hormones is cortisol. So during fasting, for example, during the night and to an extended period of time with intermittent fasting, the cortisol levels are elevated. And when cortisol is high, it blocks anabolism, that is the building up aspect of metabolism. And remember, I've talked about this before. So when we're in the catabolic state of metabolism, driven by stress hormones such as cortisol, glucagon, and adrenaline, anabolism does not take place. That is, we are not building our muscles up. So in regards to the effects of intermittent fasting, even though we are able to maintain good amount of muscle mass, even though we fast, studies do show that with increased cortisol levels within the physiologic range, as is what happens during fasting, cortisol is increased during fasting, then processes such as proteolysis is increased, that is the breakdown of protein is increased, and this does play a role in the regulation of our whole body protein amino acid metabolism. Now, another thing to keep in mind regarding fasting, and we'll talk again in great detail about fasting in a later episode, but I'll just introduce this a little bit right now. So what we also need to keep in mind about fasting is that we must look at the overall picture here. So without going into further detail about fasting right now, the main health benefits we're kind of getting out of fasting when we're using it have been shown to be related to the reduction in endotoxin production by the gut bacteria. That is, because when we do intermittent fasting, the eating window is shorter than usual, so the digestive system gets a longer break, you could say, and therefore the overall production of endotoxin by gut bacteria can be reduced. But most people are probably not doing fasting because of this, but more because of how it can help them achieve their aesthetic goals, that is, get in better shape, because by fasting there's also the fact that when we have a shorter eating window, it's easier to consume less amount of calories or food per day, which can mean that you maybe lose some weight. But on a side note here, just always keep in mind that losing weight is not always synonymous with health. We must always evaluate the cost of things. How are you losing weight? How are you getting rid of your body fat? At what cost? And we'll get to all of these questions also later in this podcast. So I just wanted to introduce this thought right here, that if the main health benefits we get from prolonged fasts are actually related to a reduction in endotoxin production by gut bacteria, then there are other better options to do that than to fast, as fasting does come at a cost that is in many other ways not beneficial for our overall health. That is, there are better ways to reduce endotoxin production than to fast, and we'll get to that in a later episode when we talk about gut health. Now, just to conclude the talk on protein, I want to emphasize that as it is in regards to so many things in life, that if some amount of something is good, then more must be better. And we often think about things like this. And this applies to dietary protein as well. So it's not that simple. So there can be problems with having too much dietary protein in our diet, like we've talked a little bit about. And it's not because of, for example, one misconception about dietary protein intake is that high intake can be harmful for the kidneys and cause kidney failure or liver failure. This concern generally applies to individuals with, for example, pre-existing kidney disease, but in healthy individuals, this is not a concern. The problem with excess protein intake, particularly when the intake is way more than the body needs, that can be problematic because, for one, if we have a high level of protein metabolism going on all the time, this can lead to increased production of ammonia, like we talked about, which is a byproduct of protein breakdown and must be converted by the liver cells to urea to be excreted from the body through the kidneys. So this places a metabolic burden on the liver and the kidneys, even though it doesn't cause damage to these organs. Just wanted to mention that here. But what's maybe more important to keep in mind is that the breakdown and metabolism of protein is more energy demanding than it is for carbs and fats. And that's not necessarily a good thing if we're ingesting much more protein than what our body needs, because then we're using up a lot of energy that our body's cells have already made just to break down and metabolize protein. And as we remember from the first episode, this is then just another thing that takes from our energy supply. And if you're maybe someone who's still quite set in the calories in, calories out model, which is a totally flawed model in my opinion, and not the way our body works at all, our physiology is not that simple. But if you're still somehow in that headspace, then you may have thought already that, I could maybe crack the system with my metabolism by constructing a diet that consists of a lot of protein, because you're going to make your metabolism, quote unquote, burn calories for you by having to work harder on breaking down all the excess protein that you ingest. But like I just said, that's just not how it works in real life, because then you'd just be increasing what your body's energy demands even more, which can inhibit you from being in an energy abundant state and can make your physiological energy deficient state even worse if you're maybe also restricting your caloric intake or carbohydrate intake and so forth. Now, just one last thing regarding also having too high protein intake is that protein is very filling, and overconsumption of protein can actually lead to insufficient intake then of other macronutrients like the fats and carbs. So if you're maybe someone who is underweight, or you're a bodybuilder and you're trying to gain weight, and you're eating a lot of protein, a lot more than you need, then maybe you don't get in as much fuel so that you can use for energy production, because protein is very filling. Yeah, so now on to dietary fats. So dietary fats can be divided into triglycerides, fats and oils, phospholipids, sterols, cholesterol, and fatty acids. And fatty acids can then be further distinguished, like we talked about, according to how many double bonds there are in the fatty acid chain. That is, saturated fatty acids have no double bonds. They are fully saturated with hydrogen atoms. Monounsaturated fatty acids have one double bond, and polyunsaturated fatty acids, or PUFAs, they have two or more double bonds. Now, PUFAs can then be further distinguished according to where the first double bond is in their fatty acid chain, counted from the methyl end of the carbon chain. That is, for those that have the first double bond at the third position, for example, these are omega-3 fatty acids. Then we have omega-6 fatty acids with their first double bond at the sixth position. And then finally, omega-9 fatty acids with their first double bond at the ninth position. And All these different groups of dietary fats are known to have distinct physiological properties and effect on health. And like we talked about earlier, fats are considered an essential macronutrient, even though many forms of lipids can be synthesized endogenously by our body. But the essential fatty acids include alpha-linolenic acid, omega-3, and linoleic acid, or omega-6. Now, dietary fats are important for a number of reasons. They are an important energy source, especially for long-duration activities. They support digestion by slowing down gastric emptying, that is, slowing down the rate at which food leaves the stomach, so basically slowing down the digestion process, which enhances the absorption of nutrients. And they therefore also help with satiety, that is extended, they extend the feeling of fullness after meal. They're also essential for the absorption of the fat-soluble vitamins, that is to be so that we can take up the vitamins A, D, E, and K from our food. Then we need fats because they're fat-soluble, these vitamins. And these vitamins are vital for functions such as vision, bone health, antioxidant activities, and blood coagulation, and so forth. So if fat is lacking in our diet, we won't be able to absorb these vitamins and may experience deficiencies in these vitamins. Now, fats are also important for blood glucose regulation as they help moderate the absorption rate of carbohydrates, leading to more stable blood sugar levels for those who are looking for that. Now, fats are also crucial for hormone production, including sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, and regulating the reproductive processes and other vital bodily functions. Fats are also important for cell membrane integrity, as fats are fundamental components of cell membranes, and they provide structure and flexibility and permeability to these membranes, allowing the cells to interact with their environment effectively, and also the membranes of the mitochondria, the powerhouses of our cells, where we make our energy. Now, essential fatty acids such as omega-3 and omega-6 are crucial for neurological development and the maintenance of brain function, and they do play a role in cognitive processes and emotional health. Now, in terms of digestion, dietary fats do help with digestion by slowing down the absorption of other nutrients like carbohydrates, like we talked about, which can help you last longer between meals, help with maintaining balanced blood sugar levels, if that's something that you aim for, and so forth. But in addition to that, they're also important for digestion because they slow down gastric emptying, like I mentioned earlier. That is the rate of which food exits the stomach. And they do that because of their effect on the secretion of a hormone that is called cholecystokinin, or CCK. Now, this hormone is released when fatty acids and or certain amino acids from proteins enter the duodenum, which is the uppermost part of the small intestine. But fatty acids are the greatest stimulator of CCK release. And this hormone mediates digestion in the small intestine by inhibiting gastric emptying, so slowing down the transfer of food from the stomach and into the small intestine, making it easier then for the nutrients from the food to be efficiently absorbed in the small intestine, because there's a small and slow and steady release of food from the stomach into the small intestine, where the nutrients are absorbed from. And this by itself leads to hunger suppression, but CCK also mediates satiety in the central nervous system. And in addition to this, the hormone CCK also stimulates the release of digestive enzymes from the pancreas and the production of bile in the liver and the contraction of the gallbladder, which results in the delivery of bile into the duodenal part of the small intestine. And bile salts emulsify fats from the food, aiding in the digestion and absorption of the fats, and the digestive enzymes from the pancreas catalyze the digestion of fat, protein, and carbohydrates. So digestive symptoms of a diet that is too low in fats include constipation and bloating, for example, also feeling hungry all the time because gastric emptying is happening quite fast, as well as abdominal pain or discomfort because of the increased gastric emptying. That is, when gastric emptying is happening too quickly, that by itself can lead to abdominal discomfort or pain. Now, another thing by going too low on fat is that it triggers the stress responses, as the carbs you eat are then absorbed and used up too quickly, leading to drops in blood glucose levels. And like we've learned, that leads to an increase in stress signals, to increase blood glucose levels again. And if we do not get enough fats from our diet, that also leads to the production of endogenous fatty acids to keep up all the functions that fat is used for. And producing fats endogenously, that is, producing fats in the body, requires a lot of the same stress signals as when we produce glucose in our body. And the ultimate goal of nourishing our body is to reduce stress, that is, to reduce metabolic stress, and make sure that we don't run on a stress-driven state for too long, remember. Now, also, by going too low on dietary fats, that can lead to hormone disruption. So chemically, hormones can be classified as either proteins or steroids, and all of the hormones in the body are proteins or protein derivatives except for the sex hormones and also those from the adrenal cortex. They are made of fats. And in women, low-fat diets can significantly decrease estrogen production, and in men, low-fat diets can decrease testosterone levels. And as a result of the disruption in sex hormones in both men and women, libido is often lowered as well. And in regards to this, it is actually also an important factor here that where the fat comes from. That is, what types of fats are we getting in through our diet and using to make all these important structures. And we'll get to that in detail in a separate episode when we talk about polyunsaturated fats or PUFAs, and monounsaturated and saturated fats. Now, there has not been set exactly an upper limit for total fat intake in literature, and that's based on the fact that it doesn't directly lead to adverse events. But just an important fact to keep in mind is that it is not so difficult to eat too many calories with a very high fat diet, which can lead to undesired weight gain, for example. And another thing here is that it's important to recognize that our body adjusts what it burns, what it oxidizes, what it burns to produce energy depending on what is coming in with our diet. And this is what is said in research. The respiratory quotient tends to reflect the food quotient, meaning that the amount of carbs and fats that our body uses as fuel for energy production is directly correlated with the amount of carbs and fats that we consume in our diet. And this is important to keep in mind, not because there's a direct competition between carbs and fats, but it's more about sufficiency. That is, if you eat more fats in your diet than you need, then you will be using more fat as fuel. And that comes at the cost of using carbohydrates as a fuel. But what's also one thing that happens is that more fat will go into storage. So if your fat needs are lower because of, for example, if you have a low physical activity level, don't have a lot of muscle mass or have increased body fat, and therefore you already have higher amounts of circulating fatty acids in your bloodstream, then your fat needs are lower. That is, you don't need as much fat from your diet. And if you keep eating a lot of fat in your diet, getting a lot of fat from your diet at increased amounts relative to your body's needs, that can come at the cost of utilizing glucose or burning glucose or carbohydrates as fuel. And it may also lead to more fat going directly into storage. So this is not directly due to a Rampel cycle effect like we talked about in a previous episode. It's all dependent on your individual needs of each macronutrient group, depending on your body composition, your current body composition, your physical activity level, your goals, etc. And then also how much you exceed that or how far below that or above that you go. Now, regarding dietary fats, we do not have as extensive research regarding the optimal amounts of daily fat intake as we have on both protein and carbs. But there are a few ways to go about finding the optimal amount of fat intake per day. But there are nuances here, so just keep that in mind. But the optimal fat intake depends on, for example, your body size and your body composition as well as your goals. Now, one way to determine the fat intake is to think of it in the amount of fat per meal. Some talk about 30 grams of fat per meal. So the benefit of thinking of it in terms of on a per meal basis is that by doing that, you most likely won't have too much or too little fat in any meal. And like we've mentioned before, dietary fats are important for digestion, for the uptake of fat-soluble vitamins A, D, and K, for blood glucose regulation, preventing large blood glucose spikes, and for satiety, so you'll last longer and feel better between meals. So always having some amount of fat in each meal is beneficial. Now, having a meal that is maybe too high in fat can lead to the feeling of too much satiety or digestive issues or nausea and so forth. So thinking of the fat intake per meal is a nice way to go about determining fat intake and then distributing your daily fat intake between your meals. Now, depending on how many meals you have per day and your total daily fat intake, the fat intake per meal can be everything from 10 or 15 grams up to 40 grams per meal. And of course, the fat intake doesn't have to be exactly the same for every meal, but at least including some fat in all your meals is important if you want to last longer between meals, for blood glucose regulation, for uptake of vitamins, supporting the digestion of that meal, and so forth. Now, another and maybe a more common way to calculate your fat intake is to determine your overall daily fat intake, which ranges from everything from 45 grams per day to 120 grams per day, or even more. Because the more lean muscle mass someone has, the more body fat, the more dietary fat that person needs in his or her diet and tolerates. So the range 45 to 120 grams of fat per day is often used, but this is of course all dependent on each and everyone's starting point, that is current body composition, current hormonal status and so forth, and then also the goals, is your goal maintenance, is it weight loss, is it weight gain and so forth. But the minimum recommendation of daily fat intake for maintaining optimal health is about 0.8 to 1 gram of fat per kilogram of body weight or target body weight. So regardless of anyone's goals or starting point, making sure to reach that limit is very important to meet the body's basic fat requirements. And for someone weighing 60 kilograms or 132 pounds, that equals 48 to 60 grams of fat per day as the minimum. Some people weighing 60 kilograms may function fine on 50 grams of fat per day, while others cannot go any lower than 60 grams per day. So like with everything in regards to nutrition and the human body, there are nuances here and we're not all the same all the time. Now, the third way to determine your fat intake is to think of it on a percentage basis, that is a percentage of your daily caloric intake. And we'll go over that in more detail in another episode, in our next episode here. But the recommended fat ratio is between 20 to 35%. And this is the recommended ratio from the World Health Organization, or WHO. But studies have also shown that for someone who is quite lean, has a decent amount of muscle mass and is very active, going up to 40% in fat may also be all right if that person is just aiming for maintenance, that is not looking to cut down on body fat or increased muscle mass and so forth. And this is based on that for this group of people, this ratio in fat shows the best hormonal balance. However, if you're aiming for weight loss, that is getting rid of some body fat, or you're not very active and you don't have a lot of muscle mass, it tends to work better to go lower on fat. And this makes sense because for people who are maybe overweight, they do have more circulating fatty acids in the blood at each given point in time than someone who is lean. That is, they have an increased release of fatty acids from fat tissue and triglyceride release, and that can make up for the lower percentage of fat from diet. So for someone who is overweight, they do already have increased amounts of free fatty acids circulating in the bloodstream. And like we've learned, having a lot of circulating fatty acids promotes the use of fatty acids as fuel for energy production. It supports fatty acid oxidation when making ATP in our cells, leading to a less efficient energy production process, but we want to improve the ATP production process, the energy production process, so going down on dietary fats in order to reduce the amount of circulating fatty acids and to promote glucose oxidation instead, that is the burning of glucose as fuel for energy production. This is what we want to do in order to improve our metabolism. So a range between 20 to 35% of fat and even up to 40%, like we talked about, for someone who is quite lean and very active, is what is recommended. And then this can be adjusted according to, body composition, activity level, goals, and last but not least, responses. That is, how do you respond to the level of fat intake that you have? So staying closer to the lower end if you are someone who is overweight or the goal is to mainly lose body fat, and then on the higher end if you're someone who is quite lean and has a decent amount of muscle mass and are active and so forth. And for someone with a good amount of muscle mass, that person uses more fat in normal activities, so they need to get more in with diet, also because they have less circulating in the body at any given point in time. So for someone who is maybe overweight and wants to reduce body fat, aiming for the lower end, 20% is a good starting point, and then adjusting from there. I would not recommend going below that. But if you don't respond well to what you start at, then you can increase it, or if you start at, let's say, 30% of total calories and then you don't get any results in terms of reduction in body fat, you may want to decrease it and go lower and see how you respond. Now, regarding the different dietary fats, there's a lot of discussion about saturated versus unsaturated fats, especially polyunsaturated fats or PUFAs. And we've talked about this a bit we talked about this earlier, and this is extremely important. And this is so important that I will have a separate episode on this topic. That is, what kind of fats we should be consuming and in what amount. Now, next up, carbohydrates. Regarding dietary carbs, they can then be used to kind of fill up your daily caloric intake after you've figured out the amount of protein and the amount of fat that you need. And in terms of ratio or total percentage of calories, the carbohydrate range tends to be somewhere between 35 and 60% of your total caloric intake, depending on your protein needs, your fat needs, and your goals. So the human body, and this is an argument that I hear all the time, that the human body does not have an absolute minimum requirement for carbohydrates in the strictest sense, unlike certain amino acids and fatty acids, which are considered essential nutrients. This means that the body can function without dietary carbohydrates, albeit through alternative metabolic pathways that we have discussed in great detail up until now, and that we now know may actually not be desirable for our overall health, especially in the long term. So the minimum daily amount of carbohydrates that is required for an average person to maintain a well-functioning body is about 220 grams per day. But the absolute minimum for maintaining basic physiologic functions without having to rely on alternative mechanisms for acquiring glucose for our body to use is about 150 grams per day. Now, the dietary guidelines for Americans do not specify the minimum daily intake of carbohydrates, but they do recommend that carbohydrates make up about 45 to 65% of total daily calories. And for an average adult consuming a 2,000 calorie diet, this translates to about 225 to 325 grams of carbohydrates per day. Now, the brain depends on glucose as its main source of energy, and like we've talked about before, it cannot use fatty acids for energy production. The neurons in our brain have the highest energy demand and require continuous delivery of glucose from the blood. That's why it's so important to maintain the blood glucose levels at a certain level, and explains very well why our body switches on the stress mode as soon as blood glucose levels drop. Now, the adult brain uses about 72 to 78 milligrams of glucose per minute, which equals about 110 to 112 grams of glucose per day. Now, the amount of daily glucose usage by the brain varies a bit in literature, but it's proposed to be somewhere between 110 to 145 grams per day. Now, when our body doesn't get any carbohydrates from the digestive system for several hours, then the glycogen in the liver, the glucose stores, is broken down into glucose and then released into the bloodstream to prevent blood glucose levels from dropping too low. And in addition, the liver also starts producing more glucose from non-carbohydrate sources through a process called gluconeogenesis, like we've talked about, using substrates such as glycerol from fat breakdown, lactate, and amino acids from protein breakdown. So the glucose that our brain uses doesn't only come from the diet, but as we've learned, the release of glucose from storage and the production of new glucose by the liver is driven by the catabolic stress hormone-driven state of metabolism, which is, of course, a very important adaptive mechanism that our body uses to in response to the environment. So there's about 100 grams of glycogen stored in the liver at any given point in time, which is ready to be used. But the skeletal muscles can store up to 500 grams of glycogen, but that glycogen is only used by the muscles themselves, and it is not released back into the bloodstream, meaning that the glucose in the glycogen stores in the skeletal muscles cannot contribute to increasing blood glucose levels and supply glucose for the brain. Now, regarding ketogenesis, or the production of ketones, when carbohydrate intake is very low and our body can't produce enough glucose from other sources to reach the needs of our brain and other important tissues, then the liver produces ketone bodies from fatty acids and ketogenic amino acids to provide an alternative energy source to certain important organs, such as the brain, the heart, and the skeletal muscles. So for healthy individuals who do not have diabetes and aren't pregnant and so forth, this metabolic state, known as ketosis, usually starts after about 2 to 4 days of eating fewer than 50 grams of carbohydrates per day, and typically occurs in carbohydrate restriction, as seen in ketogenic diets. Keto, that's where the word comes from in keto diets. Also during fasting, caloric restriction, and others, but also in part during sleep. So while there is no specific minimum requirements of carbohydrates that we need per day, we have some numbers to lean on when we're figuring out our carb intake. So some sources suggest that consuming at least 50 to 100 grams of carbohydrates per day is necessary to prevent ketosis and to provide sufficient glucose to the brain without relying heavily on gluconeogenesis, that is producing glucose by itself, the body, which can stress the liver and lead to muscle protein breakdown and so forth. Now, like I mentioned earlier, the amount of daily glucose usage by the brain is somewhere between 110 and 145 grams per day. So the absolute minimum for maintaining basic physiological functions without having to rely on alternative mechanisms for acquiring glucose for our body to use is about 150 grams per day. And remember, the brain doesn't only use carbohydrates from the food, it also uses from the glycogen stores, the glucose storage form in the liver, for example, during the night. So then the minimum daily amount of carbohydrates that is required for an average person to maintain a well-functioning body is considered to be about 220 grams per day. Now, we must remember that these are all minimum numbers here, and most guidelines suggest being somewhere above the minimum, for example, between 225 and 325 grams per day, as suggested by the dietary guidelines for Americans, for an average adult consuming a 2,000 calorie diet. And just a little note regarding low carbohydrate diets. These have been explored for weight loss and management of conditions like type 2 diabetes for some time now, and they have been extremely popular. But the long-term health effects of extremely low carbohydrate diets, like in keto diets and carnivore, etc., these are still under study. That is, while ketogenic and similar very low carbohydrate diets can be effective for certain health goals in the short term and have been proved to do so, their long-term safety and efficacy remains a subject of ongoing research. Now, health professionals typically recommend a balanced diet that can be sustained long-term for overall health and well-being, rather than extreme dietary restrictions unless medically indicated and closely monitored. And also, when people are on low-carb diets, they often don't get a lot of the good benefits from the carbohydrate-containing foods, such as fruit and some vegetables, such as fiber and antioxidants and other essential nutrients. Now, in summary, while there is no strict minimum carbohydrate requirement necessary for survival, maintaining a moderate intake of carbohydrates is advisable for overall health, particularly to support neurological functions, prevent prolonged stress-driven mechanisms in the body, prevent excessive reliance on protein for glucose production, and to ensure adequate fiber and essential nutrient intake and so forth. Just want to bring this up a little bit here. If you're someone who is maybe coming from a very low carbohydrate diet, it's important to keep in mind that even though the minimum amount of carbohydrates required per day are 150 grams for basic physiological functions and 220 grams for optimal function, you should maybe not go up to that amount right away if you're coming from a very low carbohydrate diet and you may be used to eating 50 or 30 grams of carbs per day or something. Then you should maybe you might react to that negatively if you go up too quickly. So titrating the amount of carbohydrates up during the course of 1, 2, 3, or 4 weeks is much better depending on how sensitive you are and how you react. So some people have no problem with increasing their carbohydrate intake fast, while others may need to do that more gradually and slowly. Now, another thing about carbohydrate-rich foods that's important to keep in mind is that many people react to or don't tolerate a lot of these foods, especially in high amounts, such as bread and many vegetables, especially raw vegetables. So making sure that the carbohydrate intake comes from various sources and from foods that are friendly to gut health is very important, and we will delve deeper into gut health in a later episode. Now, just to wrap it up, I just want to mention that it's extremely important to keep in mind regarding all of this, that is regarding macronutrient adaptation, is to get a baseline understanding of what your caloric intake is now and your macronutrient distribution, how it is now, how much you're currently getting of each group, before you start making any dietary changes. So just mapping out where your starting point is, where you're coming from, is really important. Yeah, and that concludes this episode on macronutrients. I hope you maybe learned something new and found this interesting. In our upcoming episodes, we will talk a lot more about polyunsaturated fatty acids and saturated fatty acids.
Thanks for tuning into this episode. If you're looking for more information or want to check out any studies I reference, head on to my website, babyletsmove.com. You can also join me for a workout through my app called Baby Let's Move, available in both App Store and Google Play. And don't forget to connect with me on Instagram and YouTube for even more content. If you enjoyed today's show, please consider giving it a 5-star rating or a like and share it with a friend. It really helps me reach more amazing listeners like you. Until next time, keep moving and stay healthy.